afternoon. Welcome to those of you who are in the audience and our panelists. Thanks for making time to join on what should be a big night of politics across the nation. My name is Marci Burdick. I am the board chair of South Dakota News Watch. As many of you know, South Dakota News Watch is now in its 7th year. South Dakota News Watch was the first and remains the only South Dakota-based not-for-profit news organization in the state. Our mission is to inform, to enlighten, and to illuminate, and we do that by specializing in long-form and investigative journalism. We do no opinion or commentary. We take no advertising. Our stories are distributed free of charge directly to consumers, either through our webpage or through email. And we also distribute them at no charge to every media organization in the state of South Dakota and some on the periphery of South Dakota's border. Our income comes primarily from donations, directed income. We apply for some selected grants and with some selective foundations, but the vast majority of our income comes from people like those of you watching in the audience tonight. And we are exceptionally grateful for your support and that you're with us tonight, and hope that you enjoy having a bit greater insight into one of the projects that your contributions help support, the South Dakota Poll. We have a distinguished panel with us tonight. I'm going to introduce them to you now for a conversation on polling in South Dakota. I'll do it alphabetically, so let me start first with Brad Coker. And you can see, I think everybody's identified there. Brad is president and CEO of Mason-Dixon Polling and Strategic Consulting. He founded the company in 1983. Mason-Dixon is a nationally recognized political polling and consulting organization providing survey research and strategic consulting services to major news media organizations, national and state public policy organizations, trade associations, public affairs and communication groups, major corporate governmental affairs divisions, and ballot issue groups. Mason-Dixon has done work in all 50 states in the United States, in the District of Columbia, and in Puerto Rico, and it currently conducts Spanish language polling at the national and the state level for the Telemundo station group. Mason-Dixon has polled in South Dakota since 1992. Welcome, Brad. We're glad to have you.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. Next is Julia Marin Hedwig. Julia, I said this earlier. Helwig, sorry, I'm talking too quickly, who is director and distinguished professor at the Cheeseman Center for Democracy and associate professor of political science at the University of South Dakota. Julia's research and teaching focuses on American institutional behavior and representation in relation to gender, race, and ethnicity. She is also co-editor of 2 books on pedagogy, the method and practice of teaching, and the profession. Her work has been published in outlets such as the American Politics Research, Legislative Studies Quarterly, the Forum, and Social Sciences Quarterly. Julia, welcome. Glad you're with us.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Thank you. And next is Stu Whitney. Stu is an award-winning investigative reporter covering politics and government for South Dakota News Watch. His recent work has focused on election integrity, government transparency, and the ballot initiative process. Stu has covered the Great Plains as a columnist and editor at the Sioux Falls Argus-Leader for over 3 years. He earned national recognition from the American Society of Newspaper Editors and the Scripps Howard Foundation, and he was recently chosen as a 2024 Election Journalism's Fellow by the National Press Foundation. Stu, good afternoon. Glad to have you.
Great to be here, Marci. Thank you.
Thank you. And although you don't see him on the screen, you may hear him from time to time as we get into the questioning. But I'd like to tell you about Carson Walker, who is the CEO of South Dakota News Watch. Many of you have met Carson. He joined our organization just 18 months ago after a distinguished career in journalism in both print and broadcast at KDLT in Mitchell, as well as the Argus-Leader, and then had a long career as a regional editor for the Associated Press. Carson came back to South Dakota, worked in corporate communications before we were very fortunate to have him join our organization a year and a half ago. So I'm going to kick off the conversation tonight with a few questions, and I would just remind those of you watching, please use the chat function in a message to Carson W. at any time you have a question. Carson is going to work in the background to field those questions, sort them, and get them to us. We are going to get to as many of them as we can in this time period, and we promise you that we will end straight up at 4 o'clock Mountain Time. I also just got a note of correction that I said Stu has a 3-year career instead of 30 years. So that is
thanks for clarifying that.
Very good point.
Big difference.
Yes, it was your 3rd career, Stu. You started late, but yes, a long and extensive career covering South Dakota issues. So thank you for those of you who sent that to me. So let me start out first for all of you. I think we all have an understanding of why campaigns and issues do polling, but why do public polls, particularly in this day and age? What's the value of the public poll? And Julia, let me kick off and ask you first.
Sure, thank you so much. And I have to admit that we could spend the entire of our time at least talking about just this question alone. So I thought, well, how can I narrow this down? And so I thought, value for whom or for what? And so I thought about, as a political scientist, but also, what is the value of public polling for democracy? And so I want to start off, because I'm a professor, with the definition of public opinion. And I think of this as the assessment of people's opinion on a specific topic at a specific time. And this is really important because it also helps us realize that we need to do so narrowly and we need to do so regularly. And so for democracy to function very well, it needs the engagement of the public. And so I think about the value of public opinion as related to representation, accountability, civic engagement, and information, which is much about what we're talking about here, the role of the media. And so when it comes to representation, polls give a voice to people and to the public between elections and ensuring that government officials understand the will of the people, right? They are the conduit of our voices. And so they need to be able to respond to those needs. And so the other flip side of that then is the accountability. And so by reflecting public opinion, the polls can hold politicians accountable to their constituents. And so make sure that it's harder for them essentially to ignore what the public preferences are. If we can present what the polling data are saying, what the people are saying, and we can align that with what the politicians are doing, then we can see if we're able to hold them accountable. And so part of that then is that hopefully it means that those elected officials can do informed decision-making, that they can do evidence-based decision-making, that they are listening to what the people are saying. And that means all of us, right? Most of us, not just what their neighbor down the street said. And so policymakers can and should use polling data to make their decisions that align with the preferences of the people. And so this polling and this sort of conversation that happens in democracy keeps the public engaged and raises awareness. And the more that we share about what is going on and what people are thinking, it makes us want to do more and makes us more engaged. All of you who are listening right now, right, are doing so because of what did the poll say? And so raising that awareness and keeping us engaged is really important. And the other part of that, like I said, is information. Information is crucial for a well-functioning democracy. We need to be able to have accurate and transparent view of what the public sentiment is. And we need to make sure that we're preventing, and especially in today's age, preventing misinformation and ensuring a clear understanding of the public stance. And so we need to do the polling, and we need to share it appropriately. And that's really important for democracy to function well. And so as political scientists, then we think it's really important to do this kind of opinion data, because we need to analyze and understand what it is that people think and what they do and what is political behavior all about. And that's really important for our fundamental understanding about politics and the public's behavior. We need to do regular polling because we want to do trend analysis. We want to be able to track changes and how do events impact what we think? How do policies and campaigns and all these things affect us? I know a lot of us are interested in the predictive power of polling, but I want to point out that it's important, but it's not our only thing, right? How can we forecast election outcomes? How can we use that for our campaigns and so on? And then ultimately just understanding what's important to people right now. Is this something that is topical? Is this something that we care about and therefore, again, want to have our leaders discuss? And so lots of different pieces there, but it's ultimately public opinion polling is important, it's valuable, and we need to continue to do it, and we need to do it really well. Thank you.
Well, I love that word accountability, and that's really a good segue to Stu Whitney, who takes that data and turns it in to journalism. And so, Stu, from your perspective as a journalist, why is public polling important? Why do it?
Yeah, I mean, we look at it from my perspective as a journalist, trying to put a scientific backdrop on what was the conversation surrounding Governor Noem's book launch. As we all know, there was a lot of national conversation, certainly statewide conversation about some of the things in her book that had drawn a lot of attention, whether it was the killing of the family dog, whether it was the phantom meeting with King Jong-un that she begrudgingly admitted didn't occur and removed that from the book. Other elements of it as well that came to light, and she was, asked to answer for on some of the national networks, but really didn't do much with state media, and kind of shut out some of the state media outlets in terms of answering questions about that. So there was speculation, okay, is this hurting her politically? But until we actually ask people and have Mason-Dixon put a scientific spin on it by talking to registered voters, we don't know what the political impact is. So we were able to, as the only outlet doing this polling in South Dakota, we were able to tell people that yes, her favorability rating had gone down pretty dramatically from 52% in 2020 to 39%. Her unfavorability had doubled from 24% to 48%. And I think perhaps most tellingly, the way she had handled some of that had affected her credibility as a statesperson, and not only among Democrats or independents, but among Republicans. And she was underwater on that issue in our poll. 48% of Republicans said she had damaged her credibility with the book rollout, compared to 45% that said they did not believe it had been damaged. So those are pretty stark, real numbers in a political sense. And to be able to not just speculate about, how horrible things had gone on her book rollout, but to actually talk to voters and have Brad's team put a scientific spin on it, I think was extremely important. I'll probably talk later more about the ballot measures, but I think also there's clearly some public interest in things that are going to the ballot in November that are going to affect people's lives on an everyday basis, whether it be abortion, the grocery tax, even the way we elect our public leaders with the open primaries. So I'll probably get back to that, but I think, I'd be remiss in not mentioning our polling on those matters certainly served a huge public interest as well.
Yeah, thank you. So Julia's accountability, you reference, basically another way to report, to get factual information when those in positions of authority won't speak, and it's been a valuable piece. But Brad, you do this for a living. What's the value of public polling from your perspective and over the 41 years you've been in this business?
Well, I'll say that my original reason for getting into public opinion polling wasn't noble. I was a 23-year-old right out of college who wanted a fun job where I could make a lot of money and not have to work too hard. So there was a huge void back then. I specialized in statewide polling, and I could probably count on my hands the number of other organizations around the country who were doing it on any regular basis, and really very few who were doing it on a multi-state basis. You had a few established polls in a few states that did it. There was the field poll in California. You still have the Des Moines Register poll in Iowa. And we sort of came in and state by state took over the country for a while and had a pretty clear field for quite a while. Then everybody else jumped in the pool, and my business model has changed quite a bit because of that. But again, when I started doing it, there was nothing out there. People didn't know anything about what might happen on election night other than the rumor mill, speculation. And a lot of times elections did not come out the way people thought they were, and they really couldn't explain it. So yeah, I got in it for fun and for money. And as I did it more, I enjoyed it more, and I made more money and decided that was better than being a lawyer. And I left law school to do this, and my brother-in-law stayed in law school, and he was a lawyer for 40 some years and never had as much fun as I did. But yeah, I mean, it's really for information purposes. And again, at the time I did it, there wasn't much going on, so and not much out there, so it filled a void. And I would be the first to admit today, there's just such a saturation of it that in some ways it diminishes the meaning of it just because there's so much garbage out there, frankly.
Yeah. Well, and we'll get to talk about that, I think, in a minute. But some questions are coming in, and I do want to get to one because it dovetails kind of nicely in terms of the issues that we've been talking to here. And it is that the opposition to the carbon pipeline seems to have crept up on politicians in the state this year, the way that the Oahe irrigation project did 50 years ago. The writer says, knowing now that the pipeline issue has helped defeat many lawmakers, what might future polling do to help in regards to solving this issue, and any plans on that? I take two things out of that. You guys might hear it differently about, how are we as journalists kind of tracking well these issues that are rising to the top that may not yet be on the radar, and this one particularly now that it is. Are there any plans on that? So Stu, I don't know if you want to reveal any kind of back conversations that you guys are having that on what you're thinking about with the pipeline issue, or what you've done. I would say from a reader perspective, that was something South Dakota News Watch was way ahead on several years ago, but before the opposition was fomented. But if you want to kick that off, and then we'll come back to that issue of tracking opposition before it's really erupted.
Well, it's certainly become a political flashpoint, and I think we will definitely be looking to do some polling, if not certainly before the November election, but also looking into the next legislative session. And as the viewer noted, a lot of the Republican primaries sort of hinged on that issue to a certain extent in terms of where they were falling on legislation that went through with the Landowners' Bill of Rights and et cetera. So I think there's a lot of talk about how that sort of schism in the Republican Party, and maybe more power to those that are sort of touting that landowner rights banner, might sway legislation. But as noted, I think it would be good to find out what people are thinking across the state, not just legislators, but actual people that could be affected by this. And I think that could also, affect the way that I would hope the way lawmakers view that issue going into the session in Pierre, depending on what those polls say. So I think it's an excellent suggestion, and I think it's one we will follow through on.
Yeah. Julie or Brad, any thoughts to that? Before an issue really is the hot button issue, is anybody kind of tracking some of those underground issues, or really does it have to get into the headlines?
Well, I can say from my perspective is there's a lot more polling. In fact, my company, there's a lot more polling going on the private side now than on the public side. I mean, there is a lot of public polling, but what has changed over really the last 20 years, it's not just campaigns, and it's not just the media. There are interest groups, associations. You rattled them all off in my introduction. And that's a big part of my business now. Is I work with groups to poll issues. And the polls aren't like the media polls where you're just trying to get straight answers on everything. It's called message testing. Mm-hmm. And, it would be, if you released it, everybody would call it a push poll. But they generally don't get released. So you test a whole bunch of arguments, pro and con. You find out where your weaknesses are, where your strengths are. And then when you put your PR campaign, your lobbying campaign together, you know what to talk about and what not to talk about. And you're prepared to address what the other side's going to come at you with. And I've worked both sides of pretty much every issue out there. Just depends which state. It's that's how these issues emerge, is somebody somewhere decides we want something or we want to stop something from changing, and then they come together and they form a group, they form a pack. Sometimes it's organized, sometimes it's unorganized, and I get called in and okay, here, what's your goal? What do you want to accomplish? We want to keep this law from changing and protect it. And so, we start there, we do a questionnaire, we do a poll, give it back to them, and then they get their PR and their media people in there and they spin it the way they want to spin it. So a lot of the messaging you see coming out, it's poll tested. It's all the talking points, and you see it every day, and it's all driven by polls that the public never sees.
Well, and there's a question related to that, which is one I wanted to ask you. And Brad, I'll start with you, and Julia, you may want to weigh in on this as well, as you've been involved in some of the poll instruments. But why should we trust the News Watch Cheeseman South Dakota Poll? And would you give us a little color about what it takes now to get a scientifically valid survey of 500 people compared to when you started, or even a decade ago? So Brad, would you take that one?
You want me to start?
Yeah, why trust this? Why should people listening on this call trust this poll?
Oh, well, I would like to think that having been in the business this long, I know a thing or two about how not to mess things up, or at least most of the time not mess things up. I find there are two very crucial elements to polling that don't get focused on a lot. And I'm a little bit of a stickler with this stuff, and Julia will back me up on it. I'm really particular about the way a question is worded, because how you ask the question often directs the answer 5 or 10 points either way. One word can shift the poll 5, 6 points. And I've got some stories on that, but we probably don't have 2 hours for me to tell them. The other thing that's important is the order of the questions, because depending on what order you ask them, how you answer in question 1 will maybe impact how you answer question 5. So you have to be very careful that you don't lead the horse to water. And so, and that they give an answer because, well, I have to answer it this way because I answered it previous that way. And if we have time at the end, I'll have a story that relates to a network news polling outfit 20 some years ago where that became a real big issue. It's an interesting story and everybody relate to it. But, the big change, and I'll let Julia, pick up on this. It's really the change to cell phones. And 10, 15 years ago, your sample would be 80% landline, 20% cell phone. And now it's the opposite. It's 80-20. I would think in 5 to 10 years, it'll be 90-10. And it'll be 99-1, probably, not too far down the line. So the availability of cell phone matched voter lists has been critical to maintaining polling, because if you have to random dial cell phone numbers, the cost goes through the roof. Nobody wants to spend it. So I'll let you pick up, Julia. You may want to add a little bit.
Let me ask you one clarifying question, then we'll go to Julia. I know I screen my calls and I don't answer anything I don't know. I do get texts from time to time about, will you participate in a poll? And I generally don't. So just as a shorthand, how many calls or contacts do you have to make to get a scientifically valid group of 500?
Well, first thing, it depends on the state. Certain states, I don't know off the top of my head, probably 30,000, 25,000 phone calls. That's phone calls. That isn't people you talk to. You're going to get 25,000 phone calls and you're going to get 15,000 dead. Nobody picks up the phone. If they pick up the phone, the cooperation rates aren't that bad. They're not what they were before. And then the incident rate is how passing through your screeners. So if you're doing a primary election, your incident rate goes down because you got to, if you're doing a Democratic primary, you got to wash all the Republicans out and vice versa. So that's all affected. But I used to tell people, South Dakota was probably one of those states. There are about 10 states where they were so easy to poll because people wanted to talk to you. Delaware was one, South Dakota, Wyoming, really small states where kind of everybody knew everybody. They all wanted to vote. But I hated polling California and I hated polling New York. I still do. And Illinois, particularly the Chicago area, it's drudgery trying to get work done there. So a little bit's geographic. But you are correct. People, don't participate like they used to.
Interesting. Well, Julie, your thoughts. Why should a consumer trust the South Dakota Cheeseman News Watch poll?
Well, I would say, what Brad's talking about, the wording, all those kinds of things, we work really hard to get all of that right. And the fact that we work together and that we're experts in this, I think is really important. Right now, anyone can make a survey, and I say this all the time, anyone can put together a survey and send it out there, but, actually doing it well and appropriately and scientifically actually takes a lot of work. And so I think that part's really, really important to note. And the fact that we're just doing it here in South Dakota, I think is also really important. If we looked at some of the national polls, because our numbers are so comparatively small, we wouldn't be able to actually generalize to our state by looking at national polling data. And so the fact that we're one of the few doing it is important and valuable in and of itself. But I also want to say one other part, which is, when Cheeseman and South Dakota News Watch started doing this and started looking at collaborators and companies that could help us do this. There are so many marketing kind of firms, polling firms, that don't do a good job, that will ask and say, well, what kind of answers is it that you're looking for? And we will, find the kinds of people to call to get you those answers. Mm-hmm. And we're like, whoa, no, that's not what we're looking for. We want an accurate representation of what the public wants to say. And so, that distinction between, an actual company that is using scientific methods versus one that is just looking for, well, give us your money and we'll give you the answers you're looking for, is actually quite challenging. And so you should trust our poll because we use, scientifically appropriate samples. We use expertise wording, and those things are really important and are very challenging. Doing a survey well takes a lot of expertise, and it takes a lot of time and funding and resources. And so, yeah, we call a lot of people to get few answers. And that's because we want it to be representative. And so that is really crucial. So when you see our demographic splits, you'll see the ratios of gender, of the counties that are represented, the ages that are represented. All of this is really important. Sometimes that kind of falls in the background, but that's number one for us, is are we actually offering a representative sample? And that's what Mason-Dixon has done for us. And that's why this collaboration has been so important and why our poll is so good.
So I have a question from one of the journalists who's watching today that said, particularly Stu, this is directed to you. Have you seen from previous Newswatch polling on the most recent polls, the results change a politician's mind or a policy?
Well, I think we need to be realistic. The South Dakota legislature hasn't always worked that way. The fact that the abortion amendment is polling pretty heavily in favor in our statewide polling, 53% to 35%. I don't anticipate abortion being legalized in the South Dakota legislature anytime soon. Grocery tax, 66% favor statewide. That's something that was utterly rejected by legislators in the last session. So we've seen a sort of divide between public opinion and legislative priorities in the past, which, I think, political cynics are not too surprised by that. But I think on the pipeline issue, if we were going to get fresh polling on this pipeline issue headed into the session that started in January, I think they would ignore that at their peril. They've already found out that it can be a pretty serious electoral issue, and we saw that in Republican primaries, as someone noted earlier. So I think it kind of depends on the issue. I think we need to be realistic. But I do know that on some of the ballot measures, the people of these ballot measure campaigns, or the ones that are opposed to them, are certainly looking at this polling, because I've talked to them. And in some cases, it affects their strategy. Some are concerned if they're on the lower end, that it affects their fundraising. And so the polling does indeed have a political impact across the state.
Great, thank you. And, there's a specific question now about the poll that all of you might want to weigh in on about. There was a 10 to 12 point gap in women and men in terms of supporting the abortion rights amendment in last fall's poll. In the most recent poll, that gap has closed. It's about even. Is there an explanation for this, or can you explain it? Thoughts on it? Brad, maybe I'll start with you on that one.
Well, I think obviously Dobbs has had a big impact on how people view abortion. I've sort of found over the years in states that were quote unquote anti-abortion, West Virginia, Louisiana, those kind of states, that actually you would find men more supportive of abortion rights than women, which was a strange trend. But there may be something to that men look at the issue now much differently than they did pre-Dobbs. All of a sudden that's abortion. I don't care about abortion. I'm more interested in national defense or something else that, men tend to gravitate towards. But now they sort of look at it as, well, gee, that really is going to be so restrictive. And they start, they're fathers, they have wives, and, it opened up such a can of worms that I think men are looking at the issue more closely than they did before. I don't know if their minds will change a lot, but it's at least kind of reintroduced the issue to a group of voters who said, it's not important. It's been the same way for 50 years, and I don't need to worry about it because it's going to be the same way for another 50 years. And I think people it's settled as an issue that was not going to get resolved or changed in any major way. And now you've had that earthquake, and people are reconsidering their positions on issues that perhaps they had 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, so this gap comparison, I guess, would be between our poll in the fall. Would that have been October last year and now? And certainly there have been some, not in South Dakota, but other legislative races and other issues where this has become a central issue and much more in the news than it might have been prior to that. Julia, any thoughts from your perspective on what might have affected that gap?
Well, I think, looking at the number, what's really changed is that more women are now supporting than were previously. And I think part of that is kind of what Brad was saying, what we have learned and what women are seeing over the last, several months since then. I think that there's been a lot more attention to the effects of various abortion bans across the country. And as we know, national news impact us here at home as well. I think there's a timing difference, right? Like that's a big part of it. But I think we're also learning a lot more about what this wording means. I want to also point out that there's still a lot of people who are undecided on this, and it's not the wording in our survey, it's the wording of the amendment that's rather complex. And I think a lot of people are sitting on this really thinking about and trying to understand what it means, because there are a lot of different parts about, various measures at different trimesters. And I think that actually adds a level of complexity. I also think that there's a difference between asking it, in the fall when, yes, these issues are salient, versus asking it right before a primary when people are thinking much more about, well, how would I really vote on this? And so I think this will be an interesting case to see, because as I said, it's a complex issue. The wording is complicated, and the timing and continued information about the effects of abortion bans and accessibility, I think, will affect women in particular more so than men.
Okay, another question that's just come in. It seems that a number of recent high-profile federal and in a number of recent high-profile federal and state elections, polls missed the results by a county mile. Can you generalize what happened? But you want to grab that one first?
I'm not sure which. They weren't my polls, so I don't know.
No, Misty. You know, I would point to, and Stu and Julie, I'm watching you to see if that's one you want to weigh in on. But I wanted to ask the follow-up question. There's this whole issue of, you hear people now, you've seen them when they're interviewed as they come out of polling places and other things, say, I always lie to the pollsters. I always make it up. I always lie. It's throwing increased, kind of skepticism, I guess, about polls, and there are some that have missed. How do you guys? What are the guardrails against that, Brad?
Oh, I'm jumping in on this one. I always told people, I said, yeah, for every Democrat that lies and says they're voting for a Republican, there's a Republican lying telling them they're going to vote for a Democrat. It just washes out in the wash.
At the end of the day. Well, I would point out, in the state of South Dakota, there was one high-profile poll done by Cheeseman and News Watch 2 years ago, was it? I think, Stu, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. That was the recreational pot initiative. And the News Watch poll was the only one that was suggesting that that issue could fail. Every other poll, or what you've been hearing as a journalist, Stu, is that people who had their internal polling, it was going to pass by a county mile. We got significant pushback from organizations that said, you guys are wrong, you're way off mark. And in fact, our poll was spot on, and one of the only ones that was. So
yeah,
I don't know.
That measure had passed in 2020. It was attached to medical marijuana. So I think there was a foregone conclusion among folks that the recreational marijuana standalone initiative was also going to be supported. I don't know if that was based on polls. I think it was based on vibes. And so the scientific poll that Mason-Dixon did had it at 52% opposed. And as you noted, there was quite a bit of backlash and people saying, you better check your methodology, because I think that's way off. And then, lo and behold, the election came in and 52% were opposed. So it was 2% off, but it was correct in the assumption or correct in its estimation that support had dropped for recreational marijuana, and that initiative was in danger, and it did indeed not pass. Another one was go back to 2018, Mason-Dixon poll on the governor's race had Billy Sutton in a virtual dead heat with Kristi Noem, which sort of sent shockwaves through the nation, led to some more support for the Democratic candidate. And that ended up being a very, very close race, as we know. So I would say, just saying, generalizing polling and saying that some have been off by a country mile is not the most scientific way of looking at this. We prefer to look at what Mason-Dixon polling has done in the past, which is the polling firm that we're using.
Yeah, and Brad, I don't know if on these particular ones, particularly when they're competitor polls that are diametrically opposed to yours, if you ever do any kind of a debrief or a look, but is there any perspective you can give us, particularly on some of those issues that Stu raised, where we were perceived as the outlier?
Well, I sort of let things roll off, because I've been getting hammered for as long as I've been in the business, because whoever doesn't like your results going to call you names, throw bombs, put out press releases. So for me, it's just sort of a normal day at the office when that comes in, and the numbers will bear out in the end. So there's really nothing I can do about it to control it. But I've had a lot of those where, we were the quote outlier, and on election day, things changed out differently. I mean, we were talking earlier today about in Missouri back in the 90s, was it, when John Ashcroft was running for this reelection against the sitting governor, Mel Carnahan, and it was a neck and neck race. And Carnahan died in a plane crash about 10 days before the election. And the national media and everybody out there, well, that race is over. Ashcroft's reelected. And we had one more poll in our pocket. and there was some hesitance whether to do it or not, but the decision made was to go ahead and do it. And we did the poll, and Carnahan was winning. And he actually ended up winning the election, even though he had passed away 10 days before. And that was quite memorable, and that one sort of shocked the world. But, you know, it's what we found. So we, you know, always, I stick with my numbers. And if I go down in flames from time to time, that's just part of the business. But I'm confident, based on how I've been doing it for as long as I've been doing it, that, you know, I'm never going to be 100% right. Nobody is, but, you know, I don't question myself. And that's
Julie,
just.
did you want to weigh in on this issue?
You know, another point about this, and actually relates to the earlier question about how the pipeline might affect lawmakers' chances, which is, you know, the public are more than just voters. Now, we ask registered voters, we ask likely voters. And so hopefully that gets us a little bit closer to what the election outcomes might be. But there's a difference between, do we want to know what the public thinks, or do we want to know what voters think, or do we want to know what voters are going to do? And those can be three different things. And so when it comes to the primary in particular, to address that point, you know, what those primary voters elected, that might not be reflective of even likely voters come in November. Primary voters are likely to be strongly partisan in either direction. And we had lower turnout. And so, you know, the question is also, who's turning out to vote? And so it's not enough to just ask about the opinion. You want to ask registered voters, but you also want to ask likely voters. And then there are a million different things that can affect whether they actually were able to turn out to vote as well. So it's really important when you're looking at public opinion to understand whether you're asking the public, whether you're asking registered voters, whether you're asking likely voters, and then thinking about who actually turned out to vote. And that's particularly important when you're thinking about a primary versus a general election, because those are different kinds of voter constituencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent point. A question came in, given the multitude of ballot issues this fall, will News Watch and Cheeseman poll again on these issues before November? Stu, Julia, would you like to weigh in? Thoughts there?
That is our plan. I mean, there's when you look at, I mean, some of those, I think, I would never want to say foregone conclusion, but some of those have a pretty heavy lead. But even the ones that seem pretty significant, like the abortion amendment, you know, that's such a high intensity issue, and you know, we're seeing it play out. First, we saw it play out in the wording of the measure through the Secretary of State's office and the Legislative Research Council. Then we saw it play out on the streets with the petition circulators and the counter protesters. Now we're seeing it play out in the courtroom. And then you get to the actual campaign. I think there's a tendency in that one where you're probably going to see some shifts depending on what is happening at each stage of the process. And so I think that one, certainly there'd be a lot of value in continuing to poll. I know Carson and I have talked about that, and I think that's something that will happen before the November election. And I certainly look forward to those results, not just with abortion, but, you know, open primaries, recreational marijuana. There's also the work requirement for Medicaid. So there's a multitude of things that we can still ask people about and hopefully educate people about before they go to the polls.
Julie, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, it's really important, as I mentioned before, to be able to analyze trends and continue to see what happens. But two other parts too, which is, one is that we ask, you know, polling, but then also distributing the information can also affect the environment, right? So as we are reporting on what's going on and saying, you know, this contention, this is what people think, that also gives all those interest groups information that they can then use to continue their campaigns. And so they are working on their campaigns based on what we're seeing right now. And so that'll be really interesting to see, you know, in the coming months, how those interest groups shift or how they alter and how they work their campaign messaging and their strategies in response to the current polling. So I'm interested to see that. But the other part is that one of the things that makes our survey good is that we get people to answer this short survey. And so it's always really hard to narrow it down into the number of questions that will incentivize and encourage people to actually respond. Few people will take a very long survey. And so we've already said, well, let's do all of these same ones again. Oh, but we should also ask about the pipeline, and maybe we should also ask this, and who knows what will happen, right? And so just know that when you see, whatever the poll comes out, that we have thought about all of those things, and we work really hard to prioritize and see, what are the most salient topics, what are the most interesting things going on, and what are things that we want to continue to see trends on in the future. And so if there was a question in this poll that you wish we would have asked, just know that it's because we are working really hard to prioritize and think about ensuring that we get enough people to answer the survey.
Yeah, because at a point they'll hang up anyway. Yeah. Julia, I have a question to you specifically to clarify one of your past statements, just a clarifying question. So does South Dakota Poll survey likely voters or registered voters? I think you said likely.
Yeah, so we survey registered voters. But what I was saying is that with various polls, it's important to see those, whether some of them ask if they are a likely voter and how likely they are to vote, ours did not. But I mean, in general, and thinking about the country mile ones that are off, right? Who is it that's asking? That's what I meant, yeah.
So Brad, would you weigh in on that a bit?
Yeah, I'll jump in a little bit. This is more or less broader perspective. Whether my company chooses or advises a client to do registered voters versus likely voters, it's always about the timing. You can't really do a likely voter poll in February for an election that's going to happen in November. And, there are people out there, and why didn't you do likely voters? Why did you do registered voters? Because I said, nobody right now really cares about November. And the pool of voters is registered voters. They all have equal opportunity to show up. We know some of them will come, no matter what the weather is. And we know there's other people who surely aren't going to show up, and other people, it depends on how they feel when they wake up in the morning. But it's easier to get an accurate sample of likely voters, real likely voters, when you're within 4 weeks of an election, maybe 6 weeks of an election. You can't really do a likely voter poll 6 months out, 5 months out, even 3 or 4 months out, particularly on a state race or a ballot initiative. Presidential race, yeah, maybe, but that's really how we do it. Just where is the poll going to be done in relation to the election?
Interesting. Thank you. Another specific question for Julia. Do you, Cheeseman, do regular polling that is not sponsored or paid for by a group? And if so, what is typically the subject of your non-sponsored polls? So the News Watch poll would be an example of a non-sponsored poll, but are there others?
Well, so to clarify then, Mason-Dixon does the polling, right, which we pay for.
Right.
So we don't do any polling ourselves. And so I guess, no, we don't do any polling, neither sponsored nor not sponsored. We're the ones who are funding, in collaboration with South Dakota News Watch, this Mason-Dixon polling. So yeah,
well,
hopefully that explains the.
We're not competitors. What most serious university polling departments do, they teach, and they're doing polling that is really more about not political issues, but maybe social issues and societal issues. I don't have to worry about a university like coming in and saying, hey, we want to do a poll for the Fraternal Order of Police. That's my territory. So, I mean, I'm a for-profit company. I have to pay employees. I have to pay insurance. I have to do all the things any other private business does. Whereas the university don't have those constraints and are freer to do more, where I'm sort of driven by, okay, where's there a market demand for my services? So without getting too far off the track, media polling has actually tapered off, at least in my quarter, because the money has now gone into the polling for the private groups. They have bigger budgets. Newsroom budgets have shrunk. I don't have to tell anybody out there that's in TV or radio or print that newsroom budgets started to shrink. Polling was one of the first things to go. And a lot of the polling you see that comes out on a regular basis, they're giving it away. And the reason the media covers it is because it drops in their inbox for free instead of having to write a check to do it. So they're just re-reporting something that somebody did and is just handing out. So there's a little bit difference between the two. You know, I always say be a little bit leery of people giving away free polls because you get what you pay for. So,
well, I think it's to your earlier, your earlier point, and we could expand on this if you'd like to, but particularly as it relates more to national races, the public is now bombarded as election day gets closer with all kinds of polls. Any day, turn on in any cable news or ostensible cable news organization, and you will see poll after poll after poll. What guidance do you give a general member of the public about how to be a good consumer of this various data that they're seeing? I mean, you've given us a great explanation of the guardrails you put in place, but if I'm just reading or hearing something, what guidance do you give about that and discerning difference? And Brad, let me start with you, and then Stu, I'll go to you and Julia.
My general rule is don't depend on any one poll. You may want to consider a number of them. And if you follow the polls enough, you eventually figure out who's doing pretty good work and who's not doing pretty good work. And then you sort of focus in on, okay, these 5 organizations tend to be pretty reliable. And then look at sort of the average. What I laugh at is I'll turn on, a cable news show, and then we got our latest poll out, and Trump is now up by 2 points, which is better than he was last month when he was up by 1 point. And I just want to, I just laugh. It's they describe 1, 2, 3 point shifts as some big,
seismic
news. And these polls, even the big ones, have a margin of error of 2 to 3%. And I tell people, if we do a 600 interview, think about this. If you do a 600 interview poll and you go 6 people one way or 6 people the other, you're changing the poll by 2% because you have 6 people who were yes that go to no, and it moves the numbers 2%. So it's, you gotta be careful about, a 3-point lead became a 4-point lead. No, a situation where you have a guy who is down 20 points and now he's up by 10, that's news. That's something that you should pay attention to. But no, I think right now you've got all these national polls saying it's a tie. So I guess it's a tie. Yeah, it doesn't matter anyway because it's all about the Electoral College. So
we'll see what they say tomorrow.
Yeah.
Stu, what about you? What advice do you give as a journalist to people about reading and consuming polls?
I think just like with anything else in politics, a level of skepticism and self-education certainly goes a long way these days. There are a lot of sources, as Brad alluded to. A lot of them are non-scientific. Some of them you might see a Twitter survey or something being put off as a poll. So, I think 538 has Nate Silver's outfit has a poll ranking. So that's one thing people can go to. I'm not sure what Brad's thoughts on that are, but I know that you can go and see how they rank the different polling services. You certainly want to look at the methodology if that is offered. But I'd like to also go back to sort of you get what you pay for. These polls are expensive. Someone mentioned that newspapers and TV stations, as we all know, are less staffed and resourced than they used to be. I remember when I was at the Argus Leader, we would team up with Kello and do quite a bit of polling. So I think it's important that South Dakota News Watch is sort of being able to carry that mantle, and the nonprofit journalism model, I think, is working in this regard, because we've been talking here for quite a bit about how important this polling is, and it wouldn't be happening, I don't think, without South Dakota News Watch and the generous people that support it. And Patrick Lally, who was my colleague at the Argus Leader, wrote something in the last week on Sioux Falls Live talking about our polling and how important he thought it was, and he interviewed me for that. So I think there's a recognition around the state that we want to know what people are thinking. We want to know what the tenor of South Dakota is in these important times, and these polls are allowing us to do that. And I want to thank people for being part of that.
Well, thank you, Stu. Julia, your thoughts about advice that you give as a pro to general consumers about polls.
Thank you. Yes, I think, I've talked quite a bit about this, and, that's probably the professor in me and the sort of concern for misinformation and such. But, it's really important to have a scientific poll. And as, we sort of talked about in the previous question, while I am working in an academic institution, and I certainly teach about surveys and I do this as an expert, the opportunity to be able to hire a company that does this regularly and has greater capacity has been really helpful to us, because it takes a lot of resources to do this and do this well. And so this scientific polling that requires expert survey skills, including the wording, including finding a random sample, including finding simply the lists for the phone numbers to call. That is really important to a survey, and that's why it's been challenging for us here in South Dakota to do it, and why we have, hired a professional company to do this, because we want to do it right. We want to do it accurately. And so from the audience point of view, again, being able to see, well, who did they actually ask? When did they do it? How did they do it? Do they have a random, and do they have a representative sample? Or are they just putting a poll up on a website somewhere, right? Like, those are really important questions that as a consumer, you want to be able to, and if you can't find that information, that should be a signal right away. If you don't know what the margin of error is, if you don't know who was called, those are really concerning questions. And so again, though, I also want to, warn you from being too skeptical of polling as well, though, because again, there are a lot of factors that go into this, and the specific issue, which is both about the wording, but the breadth of the issue that you're asking about. If you ask the question just generally, are you in favor of or opposed to abortion, you're going to get a very different response from asking about this very specific constitutional amendment with different trimesters and different types of regulations. Those are different kinds of things. If you ask those questions at different times, you might get different responses if you ask different kinds of people. And so, yes, be a little bit skeptical, ensure that you are using your critical thinking skills and that you are vetting the poll, but do understand that there are a lot of dynamics for individuals and the environment that we live in that may affect our polling responses.
Yeah, I want to throw one.
Go ahead,
one other thing in there real quick? One thing that a lot of people don't look at, and there was a little bit of comment about poll being off by a country mile. I think I know which poll that is being referred to. I saw that poll. It was 12 days in the field. They were making the phone calls over like a 12-day period in the middle of an election, and 12 days is, something that takes that long to do is going to miss a lot. We try to do it in 3 days. Most of the time it's 3 days. Sometimes I need 4, but you try to compact the interviews as tightly as you can. And, most of the time it's 3 days. To do something. And if you see a poll and you see that it took them 2 weeks to do it, the first 200 interviews were obsolete before they finished the last 200. So,
interesting.
Yeah, look at
folks,
that. Yeah.
This is the former broadcaster in me, where I'm managing to the clock. We have 2 minutes left, and I would like to accomplish 2 things. One is a brief answer to our last question is because this is a new trend. I'll call it the crowdsourced polling or the market systems like predictit.org. You get on the site, you can participate. Any comments about that? And then I would like to just do a quick thank you and wrap up, but if you could quickly answer that question.
Julia, do you want to do the self-selection lecture, or do you want me to do it?
You can go ahead, but yes, I think the self-selection lecture is exactly what it is.
Yeah, there's this thing called self-selection. When you do a random poll, you're just calling people and picking them out at random. When you put a piece of pie in front of somebody and say, "Hey, you want a bite of our pie?" You're not getting a random sample. These people are selecting themselves into the poll, and they're almost always wrong. I'll go on about online polling, and it was great when it started, and now it's all bots and fixed panels of professional survey takers that get every poll. I'm on one of them with a completely different demographic profile than I really am. And every day, hey, here's the survey of the day. And I answer the questions different every day. And it drives them crazy. So yeah, I don't have much faith in that stuff.
Well, folks, we have gotten a tremendous number of thank you for doing this. Very helpful, very helpful, very educating comments. And so I would like to thank you all personally. And I'd like to thank those folks who have stayed with us, who have sent us questions and listened, and particularly to Cheeseman and USD for our partnership in this important project. As Stu alluded to, quality journalism and projects like this don't happen without support. And in our organization, it's individual support. And so we are so grateful for those people on this webinar who have been supporters of Newswatch. Those of you who aren't, we'd like you to check us out at sdnewswatch.org. You can see every story we've ever done, every poll we've ever done, every donor who participates with us. And if you'd like to have coffee with us or invite us in to talk a little bit more to you, we would welcome that invitation and do it anytime. So thank you all for being with us and your concern about the free flow of information and democracy in South Dakota. Enjoy the rest of the day and rest up for the presidential debate tonight. Thank you, panelists, and good evening, everybody.
Thank you all.